Wyoming Territory, July 1887. The wind blew grit across the open plain as Frances Alder stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek, her boots hitting dirt that hadn't known rain in weeks. Her coin purse was near empty, her hands ached from holding too tight to her past, and the only thing ahead of her was the job she had taken washing blankets for Cowboys at the Triple Rock cattle outfit. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in Missouri to miss. A man named Clyde met her at the edge of the corral, his hat pulled low, sleeves rolled up, and a tired look in his eyes. "You Frances?" he asked. When she nodded, he jerked his head toward the low bunkhouse. "You'll sleep in the shed out back. Water pumps there. Blankets get dropped off every evening. You clean 'em, hang 'em, fold 'em. 40 cents a day, meals included. You take it?" "I already did," she said. He gave a grunt of approval and walked off. By sundown, her fingers were raw from scrubbing. She worked in silence, kneeling beside a wooden tub, hands deep in soapy water. The scent of smoke, horse sweat, and the faint sweetness of crushed prairie grass clung to the fabric. She wrung another heavy quilt over the barrel and stood to hang it when a voice drifted from behind her. "You always work that hard, or just proving something?" She turned. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, his shirt damp from the day's ride. His jaw was rough with stubble, and his eyes hazel, green-edged with gold, watched her like he was used to seeing more than folks wanted him to. "I do not have anyone left to prove anything to," she said. "Well," he said, stepping forward and handing her a folded wool blanket, "then maybe just take this one and finish tomorrow." She shook her head. "They will bring more in the morning." He nodded once, quiet, handed her the blanket anyway, then turned to go. Just before he stepped into the bunkhouse, he glanced back. "Name's Jasper Zell," he said. "I ride for the North Herd." Frances did not reply. She dipped her hands back into the cold water. By the end of the week, every muscle in her back ached. Jasper came by most evenings, not with words but with small kindnesses. He left a clean cup of coffee on the porch rail. Once, a biscuit wrapped in cloth. He never stayed long. And she never asked why he lingered. One night, a storm rolled in. The sky cracked open, and the air smelled of copper and wet dust. She was pulling the last blanket off the line when the wind snapped it straight out of her hands. She chased it, stumbling across the muddy yard. It caught on the edge of the fence, but before her fingers reached it, someone else grabbed it. "Jasper, you near killed yourself over a blanket," he said, holding it out to her. "I was nearly finished," she said, breathless. He didn't move, just watched her. His shirt was soaked through, darkened at the collar. Rain trickled down his face. "You got anywhere else to be, Frances?" he asked. She blinked at him. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, slow, careful. The blanket still in his hands. "I mean, you came out here to wash blankets for Cowboys. You sleep in a tool shed. Your hands are bleeding. You do not flinch from hard things. But I do not think you got anyone who looks after you." She opened her mouth and then closed it. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "Stay," he said. The word hit her like warmth after a long, cold ride. No one had said that word to her in years. Not since before her husband died, not since her boy David was taken by fever back in Missouri. She had not told anyone that part. But he saw it anyway. She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Why would you want me to?" Jasper shrugged, but his voice was steady. "You do not look away from pain. Neither do I." She held the blanket tighter, rain soaking into the wool and her skin, but she was not cold. Not anymore. That night, she did not sleep in the tool shed. She sat on the edge of the porch with Jasper beside her. They did not speak much. They did not need to. The next morning, the foreman Clyde came around with news. "We got riders heading out before dawn. Water's low out by Split Rock. Need 2 hands to drive the herd to the river." Jasper stood, already pulling on his coat. "I will go," he said. Francis watched him tie down his gear, saddle his gelding. Before he mounted, he turned to her. "You still gonna be here when I get back?" She hesitated. Then she nodded. "I will." He gave her a look, something soft and certain, and rode out. The days passed slower after that. Frances kept up with the blankets, but her eyes drifted north, toward the hills. He came back 4 days later, covered in dust, eyes tired but smiling the moment he saw her. He dismounted right in front of her wash line, pulled her into his arms, and held her like he had been waiting years to do it. "I missed you," he said simply. She buried her face in his neck. "You came back." "Of course I did," he said. The next night, they sat by the fire behind the bunkhouse. He told her how his parents had died young, how he had grown up riding fence lines and eating cold beans out of the can. How he never expected to find someone like her. "I thought love was for people who had not already lost too much," she whispered. "I think love is for the ones who still stand after all of it," he said. She leaned into him, her hand finding his. From then on, he made sure she had a warm place to sleep. She made sure he never left without a biscuit tied in cloth. They were not loud about their love, but it was in every glance, every shared silence, every time he took a blanket from her hands and said, "Let me help." And when spring came, and the hills bloomed with wildflowers, Jasper Zell asked her to marry him right there beside the clothesline where they first spoke. Francis Alder said yes. And this time, when he wrapped her in his blanket, she stayed. By late August, the days drew shorter, and the heat that once hung over the plains began to ease. Frances had moved into the small room beside the tack shed that Jasper had cleaned out for her. It wasn't much wood walls that creaked in the wind, a cot, a chair, and a stove that smoked if she fed it too fast, but she'd folded her dresses into the crate at its foot and set her comb and hair pins on the sill. It was the first place she touched that felt like it might hold. Jasper came in at dusk most evenings, smelling of dust and horse. He never knocked. He just leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and waited until she looked up from her stitching or her letters or whatever bit of mending she'd taken on that day. Sometimes he brought her a piece of jerky or a strip of leather he'd cut too rough for tack but thought she might use for something. He never asked what she did with them, and she never asked why he thought of her when he saw them. One evening, as the light faded to the deep blue that only came just before nightfall, Frances set her sewing aside and opened the door before Jasper could reach it. "You're limping," she said. He cast a glance at his boot. "Didn't mean to show it." "What happened?" "They stepped wrong in a prairie dog hole. Bucked hard." "I landed harder." "Is it bad?" "Hurts like hell." She stepped back, letting him inside. He eased down onto the chair, wincing as his weight settled. "Did you wrap it?" she asked. "Didn't have time." She filled the basin from the kettle and knelt beside him, her hands gentle but sure. He didn't flinch, but his breath caught when she pressed the cloth to the swelling. His trousers were worn thin at the knees, and the skin beneath was scraped raw. "You should have told Clyde you needed a week off," she said. "He's got no one else to ride out to the south fence." She dabbed the last of the dirt away, then stood to fetch the clean bandage she kept in the crate with her sewing. "You always take care of things on your own?" he asked. "I had to." "Still do?" She wrapped the cloth tight, her fingers steady. "Not always." He rested his hand over hers. "I want to be someone you can lean on, too." She held his gaze. "I'm learning how." That night, she made stew from beans and dried venison and let it simmer long past dark. They ate beside the stove, knees nearly touching, neither speaking much. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I might not ride out tomorrow," he said. She nodded. He glanced back once. "I sleep lighter when I know you're near." Frances didn't reply, but after he left, she stood in the doorway a long time, staring into the dark. The next morning, she found him sitting on the corral rail, his hat pulled low against the sun. His limp was worse, but he didn't complain when she brought him coffee. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it, rough palm curled around her fingers like he'd done it 1,000 times. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. "I thought about it every day when I first got here. And now?" She looked out toward the hills, where the golden grass waved like a sea. "Now I think about what it would mean to stay." He nodded slow. "I'd been drifting most my life. Never thought I'd stop long enough to want anything solid. And now?" His thumb brushed her knuckle. "Now I think about building something." She met his eyes. "With me?" "With you." Later that week, Clyde asked if she'd be willing to help with the cook fire when the trail crew came in. They were short-handed, and she could stretch beans better than anyone. She agreed, and Jasper sat beside her on a log as she stirred the pot. "You ever want more?" he asked, voice low. "More than beans and work and a roof over my head? More than just surviving?" She leaned her shoulder against his. "I want mornings that start with your hand on my back. I want to plant something that has a chance of blooming. I want to hear you laugh more than once in a week." He turned his face toward her, quiet. "Then we'll find land. Doesn't have to be much. Enough for a garden. A milk cow. Maybe a porch facing west so we can see the storms roll in." She smiled, small and certain. "And a rocking chair?" "One for each of us." That night, he didn't walk back to the bunkhouse. He stayed beside her fire after the others drifted off, and when the stars came out, he reached for her hand. "You ever seen the sky this wide?" he asked. "Not till I came here. Feels like it's got room for everything we lost." She leaned closer. "Maybe even room for what we still might find." He kissed her then, soft and sure, under a sky so full of stars it looked like it might never end. And for the first time in years, Frances Alder believed her life was no longer behind her. It was right here, warm and unfolding, beside a man who had asked her to stay and meant it. The frost came early that year. By the start of October, the wind had lost its summer warmth, and the cottonwoods along the creek had dropped their leaves in surrender. Frances woke before sunrise each morning, her breath visible in the dim light, and pulled on the wool coat Jasper had given her without ceremony or explanation one evening after supper. She had begun stitching a quilt from scraps left behind in the bunkhouse: old shirts, torn saddle blankets, the hem of a dress she no longer needed. The pieces didn't match, but they held together. Each one was a thing that had outlived its purpose, made useful again by careful hands. She sewed by lamplight, Jasper's voice sometimes drifting in through the thin walls as he talked low with the other riders, always keeping his words few and his temper even. One morning, Clyde rode out to town, and when he returned, he called for Jasper. Frances stood at the corral fence, a basket of damp linen against her hip, and watched Jasper walk over with the quiet gait he carried, even after the limp had faded. "You'll head east tomorrow," Clyde said, loud enough for her to hear. "A man from Nolan's wired for help. His herd's scattered. Wants hands that can ride hard and keep quiet about what they see." Jasper didn't speak right away. He looked toward her, just once. "How long?" he asked. "Could be a week. Could be longer." Jasper nodded. "I'll go." That night, Frances didn't ask him to stay. She folded the laundry in silence, her fingers stiff from the cold, and handed him a pair of dry socks she'd mended without saying so. "You want me to leave something behind?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just come back with all your pieces." He stepped closer. "You afraid I won't?" "I'm afraid I'll get used to waiting." He reached for her wrist, thumb resting just above her pulse. "I've spent years with nothing to tie me down. Now I got one thing that does." She leaned in, forehead against his chest, and let herself breathe him in. The scent of pine pitch and saddle soap, worn leather and wind. At dawn, he rode out. The ranch turned quiet without him. Frances kept busy sorting feed sacks, helping the cook prepare for winter stores, patching a tear in the wagon canvas with wax thread. Still, her eyes drifted east whenever the sky darkened, and her hands paused over the same square of fabric longer than they should. 6 days passed. On the 7th, a rider came in from the north trail. Francis looked up sharply as the horse slowed near the barn, but it was just one of the younger boys from another outfit, dropping off a message and a bag of nails. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat out behind the tack shed with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the fire beside her burning low. The stars were sharp above, not soft like summer but hard-edged, like they'd been hammered into place. Footsteps crunched behind her, uneven, familiar. She turned. Jasper stood in the firelight, wind-chapped and bone-tired, his coat dusted with dry snow. "You came back," she said. He lowered himself beside her, groaning as he settled. "There was a flood east of Elk Mountain. Took out half the trail. I rode around it." She didn't answer. She just reached for his hand. "I brought something," he said, pulling a small bundle from his coat. "Found it in a box the rancher was tossing. Thought you'd make something out of it." She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a rust-red square of velvet, worn but still rich in color. "I'll stitch it into the quilt," she whispered. He looked at her with something steady and unspoken. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause. "About that land." She turned to him. "There's a place," he continued, "west of here. Flat Bottom Creek, windbreak of trees. Soil's decent. I asked Clyde if he'd let us go come spring. He said he'd write you a letter of reference." Francis rubbed the velvet between her fingers. "I could keep washing for the camps," she said. "And maybe take in mending. We'd build a house," he said. "Not big. Just enough." She nodded. "We could plant root vegetables. Maybe beans, too." He leaned toward her, his breath warm in the cold. "I want to marry you," he said, not as a question. She looked him in the eyes. "I want that." There was no ceremony, no paper, no preacher. Just the two of them beside a fire, wrapped in silence and the weight of everything they had already walked through. His hand closed around hers, strong and certain. Jasper Zell and Francis Alder stayed through the winter. When the first thaw came, they packed a wagon with their few belongings: the quilt, the kettle, the tools he had sharpened and she had cleaned. They rode west together, side by side, toward a place where the land waited and the wind carried only what they chose to bring. And when they arrived, they built a life not from what they had lost, but from what they had chosen, each other. By late March, the thaw had softened the earth and left the wagon tracks sunken with melt. Francis stood at the edge of their claim, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her palms stained with spruce resin from the fence posts she helped set along the western boundary. Wind moved through the cottonwoods, bringing the scent of damp bark and distant sage. Jasper worked to the south, digging a shallow trench where water could be drawn closer to the garden plot. Neither of them said much during the day, but they moved around each other with the rhythm of people who'd grown used to listening without needing to speak. Toward evening, he returned with his shirt tied around his waist, boots soaked from the creek. She poured what remained of the boiled coffee into a tin cup and handed it over without a word. He drank, then passed it back, his gaze on the horizon. "That ridge over there," he said, nodding northwest. "I saw antelope near it this morning. Might try for one before the season turns too warm." She brushed dirt from her skirt. "You think we'll need meat before next drive? I'd rather have more than come up short." She picked up the hammer and set the next post as he watched. "You ever miss the sound of others?" he asked. "At times. But it's not the sound I miss. Just the knowing people were nearby." He nodded. "There's a stillness here that's different from loneliness." She gave a soft laugh. "Stillness doesn't press on you. Loneliness does." He stepped in and steadied the post while she drove the nail. "I was thinking," he said, once the silence had drawn long again. "Come summer, we could cut lumber from those dead pines east of the creek. Build a proper table. Maybe a bench." Her hand paused. "You planning to have company?" "No. Just thinking you'd like a place to sit where your legs don't ache by supper." She looked up at him. "Then yes. Let's do that." That night, They ate fried potatoes and cornmeal cakes by lantern light. The quilt she'd finished a week before lay across their bed, the rust-colored velvet stitched into the center. As the wind picked up outside, Jasper traced the seam where two fabrics met, his hand resting easy on the cotton. "I never asked," he said, "how you learned to sew like that." "My mother," she answered. "She said a woman should know how to make something last." He leaned back, eyes on the low ceiling. "Mine said that too. Though she meant boots, not bedding." Frances turned toward him, her voice quiet. "You think about her much?" "When the nights get still," he said. "And sometimes when I see a woman brush hair off her brow like she used to." She didn't reach for his hand, but he took hers anyway. "You want children?" she asked. His thumb moved over her knuckles. "I do. But not because I think we need them to be complete. Only if it's something you want too." She studied the glow of the lantern. "I used to think I couldn't want that again. And now? I think if a child were to come into this life, I'd want them to know the feel of a quilt that took all winter to make. I'd want them to see their father digging earth with his own hands. I'd want them to hear kindness spoken more than once a day." Jasper nodded. "Then we'll leave space enough for that." The next morning, she found him fashioning a cradle board from willow he'd split carefully. He didn't speak when she approached, just turned the wood in his hands, testing the curve. She didn't ask him why. She only laid her palm along the unfinished edge, and he rested his fingers over hers. Spring moved forward. The creek ran stronger, and shoots of green pushed up in the garden. Frances stitched curtains from flour sacks, and Jasper traded 2 days of labor for oilcloth to seal the roof line. They slept with the window open most nights, the sounds of frogs and owls replacing the hush of snow. One afternoon, as she knelt in the dirt planting onion sets, she felt a flutter in her belly, not hunger, not pain, something quieter. She sat back on her heels, hand pressed low, and waited. A second faint stir followed, then stillness. That evening, she told Jasper beside the fire, her voice low and even. He didn't speak right away. He simply laid his hand where hers had been and held it there, the heat of his palm grounding her. "You worried?" he asked. "No. Not anymore." He nodded once. "Then neither am I." They didn't celebrate with shouts or sudden laughter. Just the firelight, a hand resting over new life, and a long breath shared between them. In the hush of that moment, surrounded by cedar logs and earth they'd made their own, the life they built settled fully into place. And come morning, they rose before the sun and worked side by side, as they always had, quiet and strong, with love stitched deep into every corner of the home they would raise their child in. The first summer in the new homestead came in dry and sharp, with skies the color of hammered tin, and wind that tugged at the corners of tarp and roof. Frances moved slower now, the weight beneath her ribs growing heavier with each passing week. Jasper adjusted his days to her pace without asking, rising earlier to finish the outside work before the heat crested, cooking simple meals when her hands grew too tired, bringing her cool water from the deeper part of the creek where it still ran clear. One morning, as she stood at the table shelling peas, she paused halfway through the bowl, her hand resting on the small of her back. Jasper, sawing down a warped cedar plank beside the open door, noticed the change in her posture and set the blade aside. "Was that it?" he asked. She nodded, face calm but unreadable. "Just the start." He didn't speak, just moved the kettle to the stove and tossed more wood into the firebox. She watched him from the stool near the door, one hand on her belly, the other curled around the edge of the table for balance. By noon, the wind had died, and the air hung thick around them. Jasper dampened cloths and kept the basin full. Frances breathed through the hours with her jaw set and eyes narrowed, never once raising her voice. When she reached for his wrist late in the evening, gripping with a strength that startled them both, he leaned in close and waited. "There's no one else I'd want to do this beside," she said, voice rough from effort. "I know," he answered. Their son came just before dawn, red-faced and full-lunged, with a head of dark hair and fists clenched like he'd already claimed his place in the world. Frances held him against her chest, eyes closed, sweat cooling on her brow. Jasper sat at her side, one hand at her back, the other cradling her shoulder. He hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, but when she finally looked up at him, he smiled in that quiet, steady way she'd come to know. "Do you want to name him?" she asked. He ran a thumb along the baby's cheek. "Let's call him Eli." She nodded, letting the name settle into the space between them. They spent the next days in stillness. The chores waited. The garden went unweeded. Jasper checked the fence line only once, returning quickly with a rabbit he'd caught in a snare. Frances slept when the baby did, waking only to eat or feed him. Jasper stayed close, mending tools and gathering what wild greens he could find. He didn't ask for more than she had to give, and she didn't pretend she wasn't tired. One night, as they sat on the porch with Eli bundled in a quilt across her lap, Jasper reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a small carved shape. It was a bird, smooth from bone, no larger than a walnut. "Found it while clearing the north edge," he said. "Looked like something meant to be kept." She turned it over in her hand. "Maybe it's a sign." "Of what?" "That this land was always waiting for us." He nodded, then leaned his shoulder into hers. "I don't think I knew what I was made for until I saw you holding our son." "You were made for this," she said. "For staying. For building. For loving me without needing to speak it every hour." He rested his forehead against her temple. "You give me a reason to speak it anyway." Through the long summer, they found their rhythm again. Frances planted a second row of beans as soon as she could stand for longer spells. Jasper built a shade lean-to for Eli to lie under, lining the bottom with the softest hide he could find. Their days filled with the small, unnoticed work of family trading eggs with the trapper 2 ridges over, boiling laundry in a copper pot, hauling water in buckets with splinters in the handles. Autumn came in slow, with cooler mornings and the smell of apples from the tree they hadn't noticed blooming in the spring. Jasper built a smokehouse from leftover timber, and Frances dried herbs on strings above the stove. Eli grew stronger, his dark eyes always searching, his small hands grabbing hold of whatever fabric came near. One evening, with the first frost silvering the grass, Jasper found Frances standing at the edge of the porch, Eli cradled snug against her chest. "He's watching the moon," she said. "Like his mother does." She smiled, then turned toward him. "You think we'll stay here until we're old?" He stepped beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "I think we're already where we're meant to be." She leaned into him, the weight of the child between them, the silence of the land around them. That night, they lay beneath the quilt she had stitched through the first winter, their son asleep at the foot of the bed in the cradle Jasper had made with his own hands. The wind moved gently through the window cracks, and the fire burned low but steady. Frances reached for Jasper's hand beneath the covers, their fingers tangling. "I didn't know life could feel like this," she whispered. He kissed her shoulder, breath warm against her skin. "It feels like home." And it did. Years passed. The garden grew wider, the house sturdier. Eli walked by his second spring, and by the third, he followed his father into the woods with a stick he called a tool. Jasper built a bench beneath the cottonwood tree out back, and Frances taught their son to read from the same book she'd carried from Missouri, its cover worn thin but its pages whole. They never left the land they'd claimed. When neighbors came, they helped raise barns and shared seed. When snow fell, they sat close, telling stories by firelight. And every night before sleep, Jasper reached for her hand. Every night Frances held it. They lived a long life together, woven with the quiet strength they built from nothing. And when gray touched their hair and their son stood taller than them both, the love they had forged never faded. It deepened. And held.